So today's video and today's stream is yet another installment in my bootcamp series. So in case you are not aware, what is this? This is my educational stream for the general audience. So about 4 years ago, I decided to organize something that stands out from the other streamers, and I call these streams GM Neiksans Bootcamp. Bootcamp because I thought just a cool name. And yeah, up to this episode, we have had 43 episodes so far. And I've been thinking about making one episode about the English opening for quite a while, because I think it's gonna probably add an extra layer of pretty decent information for those players who are playing with white d4. I had made a very nice bootcamp about the Catalan, which up to this date remains the most viewed video on my YouTube channel. Also the Reti opening, the King's Din and attack, and this also led to the creation of one of my chessable courses, King's Din and attack in 100 variations. So I feel that English opening is the next logical step, because very often you can freely transposition from one opening to the other. Like you can start with the Reti, it can turn out to be the English opening. You can start with the English opening. Well, I'm not sure really if that's gonna re-qualify as Reti, but definitely you can transpose the d4 setups. And I think this was essentially the missing piece, maybe for those who are trying to build up a repertoire just by watching my videos. So what is going to be today's plan? So of course we're going to talk about everything English opening related, and I would like to structure the lesson in the following way. So first we are going to understand why would we want to study the English opening. Then I have divided the theoretical discussion in 5 parts. So the first part is going to be the reverse Sicilian, everything c4, e5. I believe this is the most principal continuation. The second part will be King's Indian defense. So if your opponent basically ignores whatever you're doing, just plays knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and shoot castle, which is a super popular continuation. The third one will be the so-called Neo-Catalan, e6, d5. I'm going to show you everything, so I hope you can forgive me. I'm not drawing the arrows right now. The fourth one will be the English Slav, if black tries to play the Slav defense against you. And finally, the fifth one will be, I hope I mentioned everything, yeah, questions and answers. So I would like to do it like this because I read a comment on YouTube and I kind of partly agree that for this particular stream, also for the viewers, because I'm uploading this video later on YouTube, it's a bit weird because in the video I'm interacting with some friends, right? So some people come to chat, say hello, I respond, etc. So it's a bit weird, yeah? So yeah, I'm not really sure how much I'm going to do that. But definitely I would like to make it like at least there are these discussions in the questions and answers. Like there's some very concrete questions about some concrete lines, then maybe we can do it like this. The total runtime of the bootcamp, well, it's really difficult to say. I didn't test it, but I would expect at least 2 hours. Yeah, so every single segment is probably going to run about 30 minutes or so. Maybe the first part is going to be a bit larger because c4, e5 is quite a big part. All right, so let's start with the basics. Why are we playing e4? And what is the history of, c4? Why are we playing c4? I checked up the information about the English opening. To be honest, I had forgotten it. And the English opening was played by one of the greatest players in the 19th century, Howard Staunton. And this brought me a smile because it immediately brought me back the memories of writing the course for the Leningrad Dutch, because d4 f5 e4 is called the Staunton Gambit, and it basically is the only game that Staunton played against the Dutch defense with the white color, and he lost it. And I thought that's quite ridiculous. So that 200 years later, his variation still, his name is still used for the variation. But anyway, this is legit. Staunton did play c4 quite a bit in the middle of the 19th century, some high-level matches, but apparently it was not picked up until the 20th century. And some of the world champions were using this in their world championship matches, like starting probably with Botvinnik and ending with Ding Liren. Also, Robbie James Fisher famously surprised, which is probably a very light word. The proper word would be shocked the world when he played it against Boris Spassky in his 1972 World Championship match, since of course Fischer at the time, he was really well-known killer with the first move e4. So something like c4, having never played before, it was pretty much quite a big shock to everyone. So c4 has turned out to be a very solid repertoire for most players, but I think that very often it's used for improvisers. So those who don't like e4 or d4 and they like to play c4 to confuse their opponent. And I have noticed one thing in my professional career is that very often most players, I mean, definitely there are some players who are prepared against everything, but there are many players who don't have a serious repertoire either against the Reti or the English Opening. And they're trying to play according to what they would play against d4. So that would be like e6 d5, that would be c6 d5, the Slav setup, or the King's Indian defense. So they don't have a separate repertoire against it. And maybe some of you're watching this and you're wondering, but did I not already write something in this regard from the Black's perspective? Yes, I did. So this was the very first Chessable course that I wrote. When was this? 4 years ago? 5 years ago? The time flies very quickly. I wrote a complete repertoire for Black c4 e5, which is still quite a standalone continuation because it quite doesn't fit in the schemes of if white starts with d4 and knight f3. And maybe that's the reason why at the club level e5 is not really such a popular continuation, because this is something you have to learn separately. But still, I'm gonna devote for this continuation enough attention, because I believe e5 is the most principal continuation. I think also it makes sense for the players who are playing the English Opening that they're playing the Sicilian defense and vice versa. Because essentially when you're looking at the position, it feels it is the Sicilian defense, except white has an extra tempo. And sometimes you can use the knowledge from the Sicilian defense played from the white's perspective with an extra tempo. So here, why black plays c4 e5? Because, as I already said, this is the first part of our bootcamp. That's the most principled way to continue. And I have this, indeed, very strong belief that black should be playing this all the time. And I was playing the English Opening myself, and I am still playing the English Opening myself for quite some time. But I have to confess, I always believed that c4 e5 is very annoying for white. Yeah, it's very strong, and this is the reason why at least I was mainly playing Reti, because with Reti I avoid e5. I start with knight f3, and if black doesn't play d5, very often I play c4, and I essentially get the English Opening. Now you know. So Okay, let's have a look at c4, e5. And here, let's look at some of the options that white has. And by the way, if I haven't mentioned it yet, the purpose of this bootcamp is to give you insights what might become your repertoire. So I'm going to cover all the popular systems. I believe it will be covered like 90-95% of what people mostly play, so that you have a clue. And in case you have never played English opening, armed with some of the information that I already gave in my bootcamps about the Reti opening, the King's Indian attack, and the Catalan. Probably I'm also going to do later some Queen's Gambit accepted and declined. I think you can arm yourself with a pretty solid knowledge. So here, white, so that you are aware, white has two major continuations, and I'm going to explain why. By the way, this is also something that whenever you are watching some videos or you're buying Chessable courses, about the Chessable courses we are going to talk separately, I suppose. One of the main reasons why what I would strongly recommend to you is that you always understand why you are making the move. So it's not enough that the expert says this move is necessary because I said so. So why are we playing, by the way, c4, the first move? We are fighting for the center, right? So we want to play it like Sicilian defense. For some reason, we don't like e4. After c4, by the way, black gonna play d5. And there will be moments when we can find a different placement for the central pawns. That's why. So here black plays e5. And now white has two major continuations. The first move is knight c3. The second move is g3. So knight c3, this is again one of the main continuations because we want to bring out both knights as quickly as possible and fight for the center. But g3, and I suppose I'm going to talk about it, I hope I'm not going to forget it, is to avoid black's strongest approach against knight b4. So after knight c3, let's say black plays typically a knight f6. One of the strongest approach, and if you would look back to the theory, let's put it like 15-20 years ago, I'm just saying an approximate number, so don't quote me on this. There was this continuation g3, because white would play the English opening as a dragon reversed, Sicilian dragon reversed, or Sicilian Rossalimo reversed. And here the strongest continuation is bishop b4. And I was playing this from the black's perspective many years. So bishop g2, castles. So here, if white would now play the obvious move knight f3, black plays rook e8, short castle, e4, knight e4, knight c6. And you know the point is, white can easily get worse in this line because black plays the Sicilian Rossalimo down the tempi, but as it happens, it quite doesn't matter. So black has a very nice position, so something like knight c2, bishop c3, d-Neiksans c3, d6, etc. Typical Rossalimo idea, so black is doing fantastic. So that's why this line is obsolete at the highest level. I mean, everybody has figured it out, so in case you're playing this from the white's perspective, don't do this. There was a moment when some people started to experiment with moves e4. Also, one of the best Latvian grandmasters, Normans Miezes, he really likes this system. The idea is to play knight g to e2, short castle, d3, f4, or the so-called Botvinnik system, but theory already has proven that after bishop takes on c3, white cannot hope for the advantage, because after b takes on c6, c6, black pushes d5, immediately gets a nice game, and although Normans himself likes d takes on c3, this is just not a very good position to start with. And by the way, if you would switch on the engine already favors black's position. Now, there was a moment when Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT himself, was experimenting this position, and he was trying to play e4, not playing bishop g2, and he was saying that the bishop on f1 somehow is better. So for example, bishop takes on c3, d takes on c3, d6, and Magnus was aiming for these positions with f3, because typically black wants to play a6, b5, can't play at a queen side, and that's why here the bishop on f1 stands a bit better than on g2. But this appeared at some moment, I already don't remember, I think it was like 4 years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and then it disappeared. Magnus no longer plays it. So this was like a thing for a short moment, and then it disappeared. So the point is, no longer at a good level this system is being played because of bishop b4. And now you will understand why people have been choosing g3, because they're avoiding the bishop b4 systems altogether. But as usual, I think I've been stressing this already for quite some time. There's a rule in chess. If you close some doors, you open the others. So you avoid something, but you create something in return. And it really depends on the player if he is able to exploit it. So we're going to talk about g3 a bit later. So let's still continue with knight c3. So normally black plays knight f6 here. And in order to avoid the bishop b4 line, the very popular continuation right now is knight f3. So white immediately hits the pawn on e5 and asks black some direct questions. So now mostly black plays knight c6, which is a pretty standard response. Now I know that some of the viewers are probably watching and they're saying, yeah, but what about the Adiban gambit? Yes, sure, there is this so-called Adiban gambit named in the name of the Indian grandmaster Adiban Bhaskaran, who came up with this concept, I really don't remember, several years ago, and it became quite a renaissance in the line, because here black plays c6, and what he wants to do, he wants to get a very nice activity even though he sacrificed the pawn. So for example, c takes, knight g3, h5, white is wasting a lot of tempes, white keeps the pawn, but black gets a lot of activity. So by the way, the line I just showed you, it's not really forcing engine, in every single line gives like 0.4, 0.5 advantage to white, but black has the compensation. So at least I think what you can do, of course you can go for the mainstream continuation with knight g4 in case somebody plays against you the Adiban line, but there's this also a very tricky move, queen a4. So after queen a4, white stops black from playing d5 because the queen is positioned on this diagonal. Let's say now the pawn on e4 is under attack, so we still want to take it. Black goes here, and now we go back. So the point is, black will no longer play d5, c takes, and c takes. Let me just show you. Let's say d5, c takes, and let's say c takes. I'm going to play knight x on d5, and the bishop on c8 is hit by the queen. So this is something that black should be aware of. Of course, the line still continues. There's some crazy lines like d5, c takes, bishop f5, quite a forcing line, so black insists on the gambit. So d6, queen d6, and f3. I looked up the computer, so white always keeps a pretty significant advantage. So black is having some activity here, queen d5, e3, knight c5, essentially hoping that you're going to hold on to the extra pawn. But if you're aware to the principle that sometimes you can accept a gambit to sell back the pawn at the right price, at the right moment, then you're going to be doing fantastic. Bishop c4, queen e4, d3, and white is just better. So yeah, I mean, if you know these variations, then of course white is doing slightly better. And you also see, as 11 guest is mentioning in chat, there's the move b5. Yes, indeed. So let me just put it here. Oh, wait, I did not. Here, I believe it was here. Yes, I have written it down. After b5, you can take it, d5, e3, white holds on to the pawn, but again, there's a lot of freedom how white can continue developing. Yet it's not really one single line you have to know. The bottom line is the Adiban gambit is fun, and I think it definitely works really nice when you need an element of surprise, but ultimately you should just know the evaluation of an engine, and engine says white has the advantage. So you have the pawn, and probably at the right moment you can sacrifice it back. There's definitely more variations in this line. By the way, after the bootcamp will be done, it will be available on my Patreon page alongside with the PGN. So those of you who have the supporter at least level on my Patreon, you can get access to the PGN or for just separately a symbolic price. So I'm gonna leave all of these variations in the PGN in case for somebody it's still not enough and you want to get your access to the source material. But it's not really super significant. It's definitely not a full course. So you should be ready. All right, so there's this Adiban gambit. Now the question is, okay, definitely e4 is meant to be as an element surprise, and I think also it makes sense to play it for black in some accelerated time control games. But what is the more classical approach? That is knight c6. I also looked up, there's a move d6, and there's the thing, you know, when you are studying the English opening, you have to make up your mind. Are you willing to switch to d4 system or not? This is something you have to answer yourself. So I created this bootcamp so that at any single moment I am not switching to the d4 setup. But I do believe very often that is the most principal way to play. So what I'm talking about d4. d4, knight d7, e4. This is the principal way to play against such a weird setup. So black would play like g6, and black essentially is already committed to the King's Indian defense. If you're not afraid of the King's Indian defense, so to be honest, I see no reason why you should be afraid, then I think it makes sense for you to transpose to d4. However, if you are not sure about this, you can still play in the spirit of the English opening. But again, be warned, maybe this continuation is not going to give you such a pleasant position as it could have been if you would have switched to the d4. So here you can still play g3. So black plays g6, the King's Indian defense, bishop g2, castles, castles. And I'm going to talk about this in the King's Indian defense setups, which is going to be the next subtopic. So you can still play rook b1, and your idea is to play d3, b4, b5. That's it. Yeah, it's really that simple. You're focusing on the queen side. For example, here, black tries to slow you down. d3, a3, b4, really easy. Yeah, so white's plan is super simple. You push the pawn on b5, and then at some point you seek some sort of a play at the queen side, like queen b3, rook a1, sometimes the knight goes to d2, and sometimes, depends where this bishop stands, you have the move c5. But again, we're going to talk about it in the King's Indian setups variations. So let's go back here, and as I already said, the main continuation here is knight c6. So black protects the pawn on e5, and again, now you have a major choice. By the way, this is a very popular continuation. Very often for many players, this is the real starting position in the English opening. So you have two major choices. The major choice number one is g3. I did not include these variations in this bootcamp for a simple reason. This leads to very heavy fight. So I'm just going to show you one line. Bishop b4, bishop g2. Also, by the way, why do we want to provoke knight f3 versus knight c6? Because there will be moments when you want to play knight e5. And now the big difference is after knight e5 and c takes on d5, the knight on c6 is hit. So you might be thinking, wait, couldn't I have done this before? Like after knight f6, g3, bishop b4, can I play knight e5? Well, you can, but it's not going to create black any problems because the knight is not on c6. So he can just take it and play c6, play d6, and he's doing fantastic. I mean, white is not worse if you're asking me this, but you're not getting any advantage. So black has equal chances, just like you. So that's why we play knight f3, knight c6, so that in some lines you have access to this knight e5 after bishop b4. But like I already said, I believe that g3 leads to a very heavy theory. For example, bishop g2, castles. White can play knight e5 at some point. And typically here you have to play knight h4 and very often accept some typical black's ideas like g5. There's some crazy theory. White very often sacrifices the knight on h4 and somehow the engine says this is level. So if you feel you want to go in this direction, by all means, I think it's a very fascinating way to play, but I think it's also very challenging to learn. So in this bootcamp, I'm going to focus on e3, which I believe is far simpler continuation, because what you want to do, it really depends, but normally you're just thinking about maybe can I push d4. By the way, speaking about the d4 push, this is not really a great continuation. Some people play this from time to time, but after e takes knight e4, bishop b4, the theory already is well proven here. Black has no issues, and actually, again, white has chances to get worse, because the doubling of the pawns at the c file seems to be more or less inevitable. There was a moment when at the highest level, players like Fabiano Caruana, Magnus Carlsen, they will play e4. To be honest, lately I have not seen this move at all. So the point is, white is aiming for some space advantage, even though from the first look it just quite doesn't make any sense. So here after e4, bishop c5, which by the way is my proposed continuation in my own chessable course, from the black's perspective, if black gets to play d6, white is doing just worse. So that's why there's knight e5, and this is where the theory only starts. d4, d takes, knight e4, queen f3, queen d3, queen d4, queen c2. There's so many continuations here, but the bottom line is if black knows what he's doing, black is fine. So that's why here some players from the black's perspective, they also treat that white has some forcing draws in the line, and they play bishop b4. After bishop b4, d3, d6, now the bishop on b4 is misplaced, but now pretty forcing, white gets the two bishop advantage, and again, here we have a lot of theory. So white has the bishop pair, black has an outpost on d4. Engines, as usual, say it's about level, but prefer to give white a very tiny plus. But we're going to play e3. And yeah, I mean, also d3 is a move. There's some side moves. I'm definitely not going to argue. There's a d3 move. d3, I think it mainly transposes to the g3. This is a very tricky move order. Like, white wants to play g3, and in some lines, white wants to play e4. So I think you can definitely experiment a lot in this position with the move order, but now let's stick with the move e3. So here, normally, white has one major continuation, which is very often played automatically, and that's the bishop b4. Why? Because it, again, feels like Sicilian Rasalimo. So if black would play immediately the move d5, which I suppose makes sense, I always believe that this move is slight inaccuracy, but engine says, by the way, it's playable. So we take it, we play bishop b5 here, threatening to win the pawn. We want to play d4, and black already has to take on c3, play bishop d6, and after d4. I think, to be honest, white's position is slightly better, but the engine says it's, nothing really special. So white is slightly better, But this position really resembles to me the Sicilian Taiman of ideas from the black's perspective, where black has played at some point the move a3. Thank you, Alexander Samagano, for the raid, by the way. Appreciate it. Yeah, this is indeed a Sicilian dream with e6. I completely agree. I completely agree. So it feels just fantastic. And again, like I already said, black can play d5, but it's not great. Yeah, I mean, you can do it. There's also the move bishop e7. The point is, black is quite tricky. He wants you to play d4 to be takes with d5, supposedly with an equal position. But you can use some tricks like queen b3, try to slow down black from castling short, and just play nice slow positional game like d3, bishop e2, short castle, maybe eventually expand at the queen side. So let's go back. Again, knight f3, knight c6, e3, now bishop b4. I did not include in the PGN the move knight d5. I think this is a bit too heavy for you to learn it. Knight e5 is the other continuation, which is also a very popular move, if not for e3, then for g3. But now the point is, after e4, you essentially have to play, was it either knight b4 or knight g1? So there's lines like knight x on b4, knight x on b4, knight e4, and I think that ultimately black is doing just fine. So that's why I just think that this move, queen c2, is a bit easier. You just control the e4 push, you want to play knight e5, and now it really depends on what black is going to do. So again, black has two major continuations. If black takes on c3, you have options. You can take with a queen, you can take with a b pawn. By the way, if you take with a b pawn, this is not with an idea to push d4. That's a common misunderstanding. This is with the idea to go for some closed setup with d3, g3, and bishop g2. But again, you really have to know what you're doing here from the white's perspective. And you're trying to squeeze your opponent with no counterplay. Again, it's entirely possible, but I do believe the queen takes on c3 is just a simpler move. You're hitting the pawn here, black plays queen e7, and again, white has a number of continuations, but the simplest choice is to play at some point d4. So there's a move a3, there's a move b3, but I prefer this move bishop e2, not really to reveal the cards. And if black plays d5, now you play d4. So what you want to do, you have two bishops, you want to open up the position, and then somehow in an open position use your bishop pair. For example, black takes it and plays c5. I believe this is the most popular continuation in the line. You put the bishop here on c4, and you want to avoid the bishop trade. So for example, it just make me a couple of moves. What you want to achieve is to get something like this, put a queen on g3, bishop on e3, and now you have a pawn majority at the king side, backed by the bishop pair, and you're hoping it's going to be enough to claim an advantage. That's it. Yeah, so that's why I believe that this line is the simplest. But again, if you're playing at a bit higher level and you're constantly repeating the line, probably you're going to figure it out. This continuation alone might be not enough. And that's why I'm saying you definitely have choices. You have other choices, like you can play here b takes on c3. If you want, you can explore the move knight e5. If you want, you can explore the move g3. But again, this is not in the PGN. And if you're really annoyed with the bishop b4 ideas, we can go back to this moment. You can start with g3. And I think most players who are the English opening players, they play their fair share of knight c3 and g3 as the second move. Another thing is, for black, it's not so easy to set up the same position. So we avoid knight c3 for as long as we can. I mean, black, of course, he can play this. We put the bishop on g2, black can play knight c6. But now you see, there's a nuance. There's a nuance. The knight is not on f3. So we can play knight c3. We can play knight e5. You already remember this maneuver because there's no typical counterattack with a pawn on e4. Now we are hitting the bishop on b4. Again, by the way, one of the big ideas of the English opening, you want to get the bishop pair. This is the big idea. You want to kill the bishop on b4, you want to get the bishop pair, and then somehow, slowly but carefully open up the position. By the way, answering the question about the PGN is not yet shared. It will be available on my Patreon page after the stream. So here after knight e5, here bishop c5, I can play e3, knight e2, d4, and white has a very nice position. So typically, if black would play here, take with the pawn, knight e7, knight e2, castles, castles, d6, d4. This is your dream. If you ever get this position, it's a fantastic position from the white's perspective because in the long run, black has major problems to defend this pawn. So you, of course, you want to get rid of the bishop on c5, organize a counterplay at the c file, and the pawn on c7 is in trouble. So about g3, I did not really include a lot of lines with the g3. I just mentioned basically this is possible. And I did say to you this thing, if you open some doors, or if you close some doors, like you avoid bishop b4, you open new ones. So what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the move c6. And to my knowledge, this move was brought to practice, I might be wrong, but I think I'm correct, by Boris Avrukh, who popularized it in the maybe 6-7 years ago, just before I was writing my own chessable course. And I remember that Avrukh was recommending this continuation. And this is, of course, also naturally analyzed in my own chessable course. And nowadays, this move, c6, is the main continuation against the early move g3. So that's what I'm saying. You are closing some doors, but you're opening new ones. You avoid bishop b4, but you allow c6. And now the point here is that white has a number of continuations. Here the trick is, if you play d4, black has a very nice game after e4. I think black is doing really great here. So white can look for something here by playing knight f3 as Sicilian Alapin with colors reversed. So it feels like Sicilian Alapin, except we have an extra move g3, which is a good move. So we hit a pawn on e5, e4 has to be played, knight e4, and most people, they play d5 here. There are some players who are sometimes trying to scare you with the move queen b6, but to be honest, these lines are not really that difficult to study. You put the knight here, after a5, you're going to figure out the move d3 because a4 is a threat, and after a4, knight e2, e takes on d3. As long as you know you have to sacrifice the pawn on d3, you're good. So you play bishop g2 here. Black cannot accept the pawn on e2 because he's desperately behind the development. d5, short castle, you win back the pawn, and you have a great position, while black has committed to a5, a4, which is of questionable value. But normally, as already said, after knight e4, black plays d5. That's the main continuation. And now the big difference is compared to the Alapin, black here never plays c takes on d5. And this is actually quite funny, because in the Alapin, with colors reversed, that would have been the main continuation. But now you play d3, bishop g2, knight c3, and black's central pawns, because of your extra tempi, becomes really vulnerable. White is better here. So black has to play queen takes on d5. We retreat with knight, knight f6, knight c3, this is a very important move. Instead of bishop g2, start with knight c3. And the trick here is that sometimes people don't understand what's the difference between queen h5 and what's the difference with queen e5. The point is queen h5 works really nice if white has committed the bishop on g2. If the bishop is on f1, queen h5 is just not good. So here, if black will play queen h5, black starts to experience problems with a pawn on e4. Queen a4, bishop g2, and probably the pawn on e4 is gonna fall. So that's why here black has to play queen e5. Now you play bishop g2, so the move order is really important. Knight a6, this is the continuation I was giving up in my chessable course. And here white has some chances to test you, like this game that Ari and Tari played against me. In, when was this? I believe it was the Swedish league some years ago, with the idea to play d4, put the knight on d3, but even here, I mean, the white's position is nothing special. Like slightly better. So after the queen trade, I lost the game, by the way, but I had a pretty nice position after the opening. So this is the continuation I believe that white has to dig in from the white's perspective. Of course, you could do something else. You can do like, you can play d4, you can play... The most common misunderstanding in this position is that white plays bishop g2, d5, d4, e4, or white just gets worse, like quickly, yeah? So you really need to know what you're doing here. There are definitely some lines when this is possible, but you need to know, otherwise you're just getting worse from the white's perspective. So I don't really advise it. All right, okay, let's move on. This was the first part. C4, E5, the reverse Sicilian. Let's move on to the next subtopic, and that is going to be the King's Indian defense. Also, when talking about the King's Indian defense, I had to include my beloved Dutch Leningrad. Listen, I think if white plays c4, your opponent plays the Dutch defense, you have to switch to the main lines. You have to play d4. I'm gonna explain you why. Oh, Chess24 raised us. Wow, what a timing, amazing. Welcome, Raiders. Yeah, this is gonna be fun. So I am doing the boot camp. My name is Arturs Neiksans. I'm Latvian chess grandmaster. You might have seen me in some commentary. I'm doing right now an educational stream about the English opening. I call them boot camps, and you maybe missed like 30 minutes about the reverse Sicilians, but we just start to talk about the King's Indian defense setups, and thank you for the raid. Really appreciate it. All right, here we go. So maybe we're going to start with knight f6, and then you will understand what I meant about the Dutch defense. Why you have to switch to the mainstream opening if your opponent plays a 5. So knight f6, what to do? Here the trick is, you don't really know what your opponent's gonna play. You don't know, is he gonna play g6 or is he gonna play e6? You don't know that. But that's why I would like to start with the move knight c3. Because I believe it's the most flexible continuation. And the point is now, if black plays g6, there's the opportunity for you to switch to e4. You avoid Grunfeld. So the Grunfeld would be, you're playing something like d4, black plays d5. Super popular opening. That's why some players play with this move order. They play the English opening to avoid the Grunfeld. And there's even such a term, anti-Grunfeld. So players who don't like the Grunfeld, they start exactly with c4 and knight c3. Because if now, instead of this, black will play d5, that's not really a clear Grunfeld to you, right? Because the white pawn stands on d2, there are some disadvantages. Because sometimes the pawn even goes to d3, not d4. And one of the big ideas of the Grunfeld is to organize a counterplay against the pawn on d4, which is not going to be there. Like in these lines, c takes, knight takes, g3, bishop g2, white plays d3, the pawn is not on d4. Again, big discussion. This is not the point of this bootcamp. But what I am saying is this is one of the reasons why the English opening is very often a popular choice among all levels. So we are going to start with g6. Yeah, by the way, with the move g3, I think the difference is really tiny, to be honest. So if you want, you can play g3. If you want, you can play knight c3. Again, it's all about the discussion. You close some doors, you open new doors, etc. I suppose it makes sense if you're really serious about it and you're preparing against some specific opponent, and I'm talking about over-the-board games. Then you're looking up what's his response either after g3 or knight c3, right? That's the best advice I can give you. So knight c3, g6, and again, we had this discussion. If you are a principal player and you are going to use the English opening as a way to make a transition from English opening or from the ready to English, from English to d4, from d4 to Catalan, etc., it's very interesting. I think you have to play the most principal continuation. You have to play e4, you just have to. But again, for the sake of simplicity of the bootcamp, I'm going to avoid it. But I do believe you should not be afraid of the King's Indian defense. And probably I'm going to have to make a separate bootcamp, propose you some ideas how to play against King's Indian defense. Very often people are afraid of what they don't know. It's really that simple. But all right. So we are going to play g3. Black plays bishop g7, bishop g2, castles. And again, here's the discussion about d4. You can always switch to it. Knight f3 is going to be the main move, but there are some players who really like the Botvinnik system. And this system was brought to the practice, as the name suggested, by Mikhail Botvinnik, the former world champion. And it's a very poisonous system with the idea to play d3, knight e2, short castle, and probably f4. Super simple. But there are some problems, to be honest. I think that black is doing fantastic if he plays like d6, like he plays like c5. And I looked at these lines. Sure, I mean, white has some kingside attack possibility, f4, h3, g4, etc. But black's counterplay at the queenside is super straightforward. Like b5, trade the pawns, open up the queenside, and your pawn march at the kingside is probably not gonna wield any results. After c4, knight f6, is there any real difference between the move order? I suppose we can talk about it in the questions and answers, right? Again, like I already said, you open some doors, you close some other doors, etc. It's always like this. There is no perfect move order. That's what I'm saying. But here we are going to play knight f3, d6, short castle, and most likely black has to choose. Does he want to play c5 or does he want to play e5? So which one is it going to be? I mean, if he plays c5, again, d4, I suppose you have to play d4. No matter how much we talk about it, this is something you simply have to do. But I looked at this continuation. Maybe you can still play b3, bishop b2, and d4. So the point is, if black ignores what you're doing, perhaps you will get access to d4. And this, by the way, is a position you want to study in detail. I can play this numerous times in my career. And with the maneuver knight c2, knight e3, knight e5, white always gets a very nice and pleasant edge because of this outpost on d5. So for example, like knight d4, queen d4, bishop c6, knight e5, knight e8, here, white is always pushing. No matter how you look, white is pushing. Rook goes here, the other rook goes here, the black plays e6, this pawn is thermally weakness. Super, super simple. But of course, there's some problems with this approach, is that if you play b3, black can play knight e4. a typical move to exploit the pin on the long diagonal. And now after some trades, maybe white can still push something. Like e4, have some space advantage. I don't know. I mean, is it enough? Probably not, but maybe you have some pressure. Yeah, I see you have some questions. Let's maybe, again, keep those specific questions of the questions and answers, all right? So c5 is a move. There's also the move e5, and this is the moment where you're playing to the typical English opening. You play d3, you play rook b1, you play b4, b5. This is your plan. Again, black has number of choices. I included all of these continuations in the PGN. For example, let's say black goes here, black here, and at some point you might revisit the idea to play d4, even here. Yeah, like d4 takes it, and it feels like you're playing some sort of a Dutch defense where white is simply doing better. How often do you transpose into something like this from the red to your king's in an attack? There are definitely a lot of transpositions. I suppose it really depends how you play it out, but this is a highly transpositional line, so if you're playing the red the opening, I suppose it makes sense for you also to study the English opening if you want to play some c4, because again the question is, what is reti? What is reti? Is reti only knight f3, g3, bishop g2 and d3, or is reti also c4? Because the way I see it, whenever the pawn is on c4, it's already in the realm of the English opening. Maybe it doesn't really matter, because also in this bootcamp we're going to talk about some stuff which is gonna overlap with things I talked in my Catalan bootcamp. This is not on YouTube live, but it will be uploaded to YouTube a week later. So again, this is the typical idea for for white to play at the queen side. For example, if black goes knight h5 immediately, you play b5. By the way, did you notice this? Black wants to play f5. And that's why, again, our discussion about the Dutch defense is going to start. So b5, queen b3, bishop b2. So white's idea here is almost always the same. And now the most important part. If you are playing with white, you know you want to get more or less this position. I totally get it that black's pawn march feels dangerous. But you have to take my word on this. It's not. Ignore those pawns. Do not touch these pawns. Do not touch these pawns under any circumstances. Because if you do, it's going to fuel your opponent's attack. So your opponent is going to throw at you all of his pawns. He's going to play f4, he's going to play g5, he's going to play g4, he's going to play h5, h4, etc. It's not a mate. It looks scary, it's not a mate. So again, you're going to have to take my word on this. What you should be doing is focusing on the queen side. And the typical idea is how you can focus on the queen side is knight e2, because the knight on f3 doesn't do much. You play c5 at some point, or you also play rook a1. So the typical idea why the knight goes to d2, you want to play c5. Sometimes this might involve a pawn sacrifice, put the knight on e4. Now this pawn is under attack, and if he plays b6, you play knight c5, and you regain everything with a big positional interest. So, again, maybe another line, let's say black plays knight e4, which is a pretty common move. And what I wanted to say about the knight e2 is a typical maneuver for the English opening is to play knight e2. Don't be surprised about this move. And I think it should be under your radar. You could ignore the knight on e4 to play e3 to push it back. So it's a very common thing. And I don't think you really want to take on d4 here, because it's going to open up the e file followed by bishop g4, and there's going to be a pretty serious pressure. So you can ignore the knight on d4, like either play knight e2 or play b4 here, takes, and again you want to play b5, you want to create targets. Here, for example, bishop g4, black insists you to take on d4, and maybe there's some moments when you don't really have a choice, like for example here. You take on d4, you play knight e4, and you still have some pressure on these pawns, but again the question is, how much is it? Let me go back here and try to see if I missed any continuations. So mostly against the King's Indian defense, it's really simple. You play g3, bishop g2, knight f3, shoot castle. These are your next moves. There might be moments when you could decide not to touch the d pawn at all. So the idea is you want to play rook b1, b4, b5, and maybe you get to play d4 in one go. So if I was you, I would not rush with the move d3, because maybe you're going to need the d4 push in one go. But since your opponent plays e5, I suppose some ideas like e4 might already be a threat at some point, so I suppose you need to move d3. d3, knight c6, and again, as long as you remember, there could be circumstances when you can go for the d4 break, you can make a different, you can suddenly change the character of the position. And by the way, this is also sometimes that some players forget. They think that if I committed to d3, does it mean I can never touch the d pawn again? There's no such rule. There's no rule that says you cannot touch the same pawn twice. Now I know what some books say, what authors and some coaches say, you're not supposed to touch the same pawn twice. But to every rule, there's an exception. So if you can play d4 and generate some targets in this position, you can do it. Yeah, please keep simple questions. Like if you're giving me some philosophical questions, I have difficulties to think about the answer. Maybe I can answer these questions in the questions and answers part. Like I can right now answer some really simple questions, but like if you're asking me some philosophical questions, yeah, I think I'll leave it for the questions and answers part. And now we go back to the Dutch. Now, if you're following all of this, you're wondering, why not start with a 5? Because why does this, and this, and this, and this again? If you do not play d4, the mainstream theory of the Dutch, you play d6, you play d3, and you allow your opponent to play e5, you see what happened? Is that black essentially tricked you by having not the pawn on f7 but on f5, because this is what he wants anyway. He wants this anyway, so he wants to play h6, g5, f4, g4, etc. And for this, he does not need to move the knight. That's what I'm saying, is that you can play the English opening against the Dutch defense, but it just kind of doesn't make sense, because your opponent will immediately get the perfect King's Indian defense setup with a pawn on f5. Now, that being said, you can do it. You can do it, but it just quite doesn't make any sense. So again, I think it's more logical to pursue the mainstream theory involving d4. As soon as you see your opponent plays f5, you play d4. And you study some Dutch. By the way, I've written a Dutch course for black on Chessable. Yeah, so you carry out the same plan. Have I read Nicholas Ntirlis' book on the English opening? I have not. But knowing that Ntirlis is an excellent author, I think he definitely gives some very nice advice. Like I've seen his book on the Catalan with the move early h4, which is a fascinating idea. So definitely a great author. And again, here you carry out the same idea. You play bishop e2. And now this is the moment when black tries to scare you. He tries to scare you with these pawns. Look at this. Like g5, like knight g6. It looks so scary. So you want to do something at the king side. Do not touch the king side pawns. So you play the queen side. You play the queen side. You want to trade the rooks. Get to the pawn on b7. Rook a7, and again here comes the c5 move. So this c5 is simply necessary to open up the queen side. Sometimes it might involve a pawn sacrifice, like this, knight a4, knight c4. You're winning back the pawn and you're calling the shots. So it's not really clear how black can stop this. Maybe black can play like b6 at some point, this. But it weakens the c6 square. Think about knight a2, knight b4, knight c6 ideas, and all of this is very slow. Like again, this, bishop d7, I could, let's say, play knight c6, I'm not really sure, maybe b pawn, you play g4, and even in the worst case scenario, look at this, so with what is he trying to checkmate you? The 2 pawns. And that's it. I mean, the queen is so far away from d8. But again, many players, they cannot really stand it. They're afraid of these pawns and they want to react in some way. That's what I'm saying. Do not react. Understand that engine is on your side. That's why here, after the Dutch, you can play the English opening. But I suggest you have to learn some mainstream theory. All right, let's move on. The next part, which is the third part. So we have 5 parts. Those of you who missed the very start of this bootcamp, we have 5 parts of this bootcamp. The first part was reverse Sicilian, c4, e5. The second part was what we just discussed, the King's Indian setup. And now we're going to talk about the symmetrical English. So, now what? Naturally, there's many setups. You can do whatever. I know there's so many great authors. Like Michael Marin, he has written some books on the English opening. There's some Chessable courses. Again, about the Chessable courses, we're going to talk separately. So I would like to propose you a rather simple setup, which is easy to remember. So we are going to play knight f3 with the idea to play d4 immediately to get some clarity. I recommend you avoid knight c3. Why is this? Because if you play knight c3, black plays early g6, so he is essentially copying you, what you could have done. And now the point is, of course, you can play g3, you can play bishop g2 and d3 and knight f3 and bishop d2 and whatever. So all of this is perfectly playable, but it's quite difficult to get anything real. Again, maybe I'm quite biased. It could be. So I never really been very fond of the g3 setup. And now the difference here is if you try to go for the d4, like you play knight f3 and you play d4. Because those of you who have watched my boot camps, you do know that one of the first additions I made was the Marozzi. The Marozzi bind. So let's say black plays d6, hooray, the Marozzi bind, perfect. There's an entire bootcamp about this, how to play this out, and I love it, you know. Ever since I learned how to play the Marozzi bind, I've scored so many important points. But the trick is, you're not in time. You're not in time from this move order to get the Marozzi bind. And you know why? Because of knight c6. And if you think you get to rearrange the pieces on e4, like you want to do this and this and this, all you need to know, this move is really good. Bishop takes on c3, queen a5, and black has a very easy plan. Knight f6, d6, bishop e6, rook c8, and try to, what's the term? Tickle the pawns, yeah? Tickle the pawns. So Engine says that this is kind of acceptable to white, but it's borderline. It's borderline. And black is actually quite happy to give up the darks to a bishop, and mostly for white, this move, bishop c3 comes as a major shock. How can you play like that? How can you give up? There's such a strong bishop on g7, but again, remember, chess is a very concrete game. Here it works. As Viswanathan said his famous quote, I don't care if it's weird. If it works, it works. So queen a5, here look at this. d6, bishop e6, knight e5, rook c8. And even though I once won a very nice game against a very exciting Brazilian grandmaster, Alexander Fier, he played this against me. This was a rapid game. I was not impressed about the results in the opening. So that's why mainly I suggest to avoid knight c3 and starving knight f3. So you just want to play d4 basically against everything that happens. Now black has two choices. I think that most of the players you're going to play against, it's going to be random. Is it going to be knight c6? Is it going to be knight f6? What does it matter? Actually, there's a pretty big difference. There's a third move also, which is the move d5, which to be honest makes no sense, because now you just take it, and this is a very famous trap. Some people there might be thinking they could trick you with this move order and then capture d5 with the knight, but if you know this trick, you're going to win some easy points. I mean, of course, depending on your level. The point is you're going to take the pawn, there's queen f4 check. One of the first tricks I ever learned, I believe this was published in some Latvian book. Like Latvians playing in World Chess Olympiads, and this trick was on the cover. Yeah, that's how I learned it. That's a fork, and black cannot do this. Black simply cannot do this. So he takes with a queen, and you just get the lead in the development. That's all you need to know. Like, you have two knights, your opponent has moved a queen twice. Yeah, so it's not good. All right, let's just forget this. And maybe have a look at the move knight f6. Again, there's a pretty big theory. Like, you can play g3, you can play knight c3, but for this bootcamp, I decided to offer you something simple so that it's easy for you to remember, so that also for you, this bootcamp could serve as your first steps in the English opening. And I'm never going to claim that this is a full repertoire, and I definitely don't want to take any credit away from the amazing authors who are writing books, who are writing Chessable courses or some other courses like Chessly. I saw Chessly also was mentioned. These courses are definitely more complex with more lines. So this, again, this is like an introduction for somebody who has like never played English opening. You're wondering how it would be, right? Maybe for somebody it's going to be enough with even just this bootcamp. You never know. So d4. So we're going to still play d4, and all you need to remember, if your opponent doesn't take on d4, insta d5. That's all you need to know. This is a very common answer to any d4 setups. Like, let's say you're playing from the white's perspective, you're playing d4, knight f6, c4, and c5. You have to play d5. That's the best move against any early c5. With a pawn on c4, automatic d5, no discussion about it. So that's why here, if your opponent, If your opponent is not taking on d4, you play d5 immediately. So that's why he has to take it. Knight e4, e6, and you play knight c3. By the way, there's of course a very fair chance that this position will just transpose. Like, it might transpose very often to the Marazzi. Like, your opponent could go here, he could go here, there you go, e4, Marazzi bind, check one of my boot camps on the topic. Your opponent could play d6, again, e4. Immediately Marazzi bind, fantastic. But he has to play e6, I believe this is the best continuation. You play knight c3, and now black has again some choices. If he plays bishop b4, I suppose the most challenging move. There are some tricky lines. I'm not gonna really talk about it too much. I think you can basically play any quiet continuation. Like, you can play like bishop d2, you can play like queen c2, but I included this challenging continuation, g3, to try to play in the spirit of the Catalan. And very often, yeah, some of the ideas, some of the positions, they might transpose to the Catalan. So black has potentially some problems with the bishop on c8. Let's say castles, bishop g2, d5. I think you can just castle short, or let's say c takes, knight e5, and bishop d2. Black could take your knight on c3, but the question is he not going to be suffering because of the bishop on c8? There's a question how long I'm streaming, not so much lately, like once or twice a week, but it's going to change, I promise. So there's this tricky line with knight e4. Black immediately tries to exploit the pin. And after queen c2, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have included this. Actually, this is quite contradicting to the light approach I was proposing. But after queen a5, bishop g2, knight c3, there's some crazy lines with the short castle. Yeah, actually, I shouldn't have included this. I think that you can ignore this. You can check the PGN if you're interested about this line. I'm not really sure how frequently will you get, but probably you can just play like I already said, bishop d2. Bishop d2, e3, you're never going to be worse. There's also the move d5, which I suppose it makes sense why black played d6 in the first place. You take it, and there's a typical maneuver bishop d2. You want to take on c3 with the bishop. And here the trick is you can try to fool your opponent. Again, try to get to the Catalan. You can play g3, and if the opponent automatically plays a short castle, I think it feels like a great Catalan. Like, for example, knight c3, bishop c3. Black has problems. So even though we have a symmetrical pawn structure on the board, the bishop on g2 makes black's position quite unpleasant. But there's a good move, bishop f6, after g3. And I suppose you have to play e3, bishop d4, e takes on d4, and according to an engine, this is equal. So I didn't really analyze this any deeply, but if you're concerned about this, you can just play e3 and just get a good game. So it's quite quiet and quite nice. Let's say knight c3, bishop c3, the bishop goes to f3, rook goes to c1, queen goes to b3. No issues. All right. And there's also the other move. The other move transposes to knight c3, a3. This is something I wanted to show you. That's it after knight f6. These are the main lines. So you're going to see there's not really so much theory. So you'll be set at least for the next 10 moves. He can play also knight c6. Your approach is the same. You play d4. You play knight e4. And guess what you want to do? You want to play the Marazzi bind, you want to play e4. So most likely your opponent has to stop you. If he doesn't stop you, you play e4. So he can stop you with many moves. Like, okay, g6 is obviously e4. d5 just doesn't make any sense. You play knight c3, and you get a huge lead in development. It just kind of makes no sense for black to do this. So I think the most principal combination after knight e4 is either knight f6 or queen b6. After queen b6, by the way, I think that this was played by Yevgeny Romanov in the World Chess Olympiad. He played this against me, and I just couldn't remember the theory. I was quite caught off guard by this continuation. So he played something like this, and I played e4. So this is what I played in the Olympiad. e4, bishop b4, and bishop d3. And supposedly black is doing all right. Although I had the idea that this is in favor for white. I mean, I had some memories. Is the pawn on e5 as a possibility? Sure. I mean, oh, you mean here? The pawn on e5, there is such a move, yes. You play it like the Sicilian Sveshnikov. You want to get the knight on d6. But the point is, you're not playing e4. Why would you weaken the d4 square? For no good reason. You just develop the pieces like normally, but put the pawn on e3 to control the d4 square. It just looks really nice. For example, castles. Put the knight on d5. Put the knight on c3. That's a weakness. Queen d2, rook d1, rook c1, bishop f3, b3. Real easy game. So I think that here, this maybe it would not be the Sveshnikov, it would be like Kalashnikov variation. So the difference here, compared to the Sicilian Kalashnikov, the pawn stands here, and the white pawn stands on e4. So no, e5 is not a very good line because white can play e3, not e4. So anyway, this line I was mentioning to you, this queen b6. Here white gets the better position. And again, the big idea is to play e4, and as you're going to see, a3 is a very common move in this position. So you want to play e4, bishop e3, and keep the knight on c3. So for black, try to get a sharper game. I figured that the only continuation is to play d5, try to sacrifice a pawn, but you don't have to accept it. Bishop e3, take it, and guess what? g3. It's really nice position again. So you want to play bishop g2, castles, rook c1, knight e4. How difficult can it be? So it's really simple setup. And I don't think that this queen b6 is causing any problems to you. It should not. Just play knight b3. The knight on b3 feels a bit weird, but so does the black queen on b6. So you want to play knight c3 and stop any bishop b4. Let's say if he plays e6, actually... wait, yeah, you play knight c3. If he plays bishop b4, I think you can just play bishop d2. I don't see any problems. Then you play a3, and does he really want to take on c3? I think not. So, what else is there? And finally, we go to the main line of this continuation, which is knight c6, d4, takes. Black stops you, we insist. And again, here, black might play this in the spirit of the Sicilian Sveshnikov. He might play e5, he might even think this is the same. It's not the same, because the white pawn is not on e4. You go here, you play like Sveshnikov, you take on f6, but the difference is you play e3. And again, your idea is same. Bishop e2, should castle, knight b1, knight e5, knight c3. White always is slightly better. I'm not going to argue that definitely black has some dynamics, but is it enough for the multiple weaknesses that he has created himself in the position? That remains to be seen. So he can play it like a Sveshnikov. If he plays g6, you play e4, again the Maratsi bind. Finally, what else is there? So he has to play e6. You just want to play e4, right? He has to play e6. Now the point is, this is not really so great, because black gets to play bishop b4, and you have some problems to defend the pawn. But you want to play e4. What do? You play a3. You want to play e4. I also included in the PGN the testing line knight d to b5. You want to play bishop f4, you want to play bishop d6 or bishop c7 or knight c7 or whatever, but so that you know this line does not work if black is ready for it. It works wonders if black is not ready. If black is scared of the bishop f4, knight e6, and he plays like d6 here. But if he knows d5, he immediately equalizes the game. The point is, there's the move e5. And all of these complexities, black is just doing great. And actually it's white who has to be careful. So this is a very old theory, and I think that anybody who has studied this line a long time ago, they know this. So this is not really a surprise. And I would keep the knight b5 for maybe some surprise moments. So if your opponent plays d6, so you go bishop f4, e5, bishop g5, trade on f6, play e3, you immediately get the better position. But if your opponent plays d5, well, then you have nothing. So you know what you are entering. But I assume you want to fight for the advantage. And you want to play e4, but there's the bishop b4 problem. So what do? You play a3. You want to play next e4. And again, there's a chance that this position might transpose. What about d5, c6, c6, and bishop f4? Again, you have to take my word on this. It just doesn't work. Yeah, d5, c6 is knight e5, and after knight e5, e6 and d5, and there's no bishop f4. You're not in time. You're not in time. There's queen f5 check. Just trust me. It doesn't work. I've checked this line thoroughly. It just doesn't work. Now you have to go back. There's d4, and you're actually in trouble. So simply don't go here. Again, if you're entering this line, be ready that you have to enter the drawish line. You just play the draw. No problem. But we are playing for the advantage. We play a3. Again, if black plays queen b6, I think you can just transpose with knight b3. Knight b3, d5, bishop e3. You remember this line, right? c6 takes g3, bishop g2. So it's always slightly better for white. So I suppose black has to do something about your e4, because if he does nothing, you play e4. So there's the move d5 here. But you always keep the better position. You take it. Again, e6 on d5 is g3. You know this. You know this. g3, bishop g2, isolate the pawn on d5. If you're really curious, you can check my bootcamp on the topic Isolated Queen's Pawn Structure, IQP. I talk about the structure, the typical ideas, what you're supposed to do. It's just instantly better for white. And if black takes on d5 with the knight, you take on c6, you play bishop d2, and you push e4. Immediately better for white. Because black has problems on c6, which is something you can easily target. I think it's fantastic. You couldn't get more from the opening. So he cannot play d5, and you want to play e4. So how is he supposed to stop you? It's either the bishop c5 or queen b6. Again, if he plays queen b6, it's knight b3. So it's got to be bishop c5. Now you play knight b3. If he plays bishop e7, you play the Marazzi bind. Short castle, bishop e3, knight e4. For further reference, maybe you can check the hedgehog position. I think I made a bootcamp about it, the hedgehog from the black's perspective, except here white has committed to knight on c6. So this could be a great starting point. And if black retreats with a bishop on b6, again you play c5 here, and same stuff, g3. You know, this g3, this Catalan idea always keeps coming back. You're playing against the bad bishop on c8. So g3, bishop g2, and white always keeps a slight edge. What if d5? I already talked about d5. What if black plays bishop c5 after knight b5? There's no knight b5. In which line? I really don't remember. There's almost nowhere knight b5. So in the end, black probably could play something like bishop e7, and you just play it e4. e4, short castle. And this is one of my games that I played 9 years ago against Samuel Shankland, I believe in Norway. It was Fagernes Open 2016, if I'm not terribly mistaken. Sam was only still climbing as a player. I believe at the time he was working, I think, with Magnus Carlsen. Maybe that's why he was in Norway. And I played bishop e2. And we just agreed to a draw. Nice GM draw. Nice GM draw. But of course you have to stop it. So knight f3, and here the game continues. Bishop e2, short castle, rook e1, b4, bishop f1, bishop b2, etc. So again, we are playing some sort of hedgehog position. I think it's really nice. After knight b5, the testing variation. You mean here, knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight b5. Oh, you mean bishop c5? I don't remember. I think it's bishop f4. Ah, yes, now I remember. Oh, I should have included this. Yeah, this is a good question. This is a good question. Yes, yes. You play bishop f4. The point is, this is not in the PGN. Maybe I'm going to include it if I'm going to remember. This check is nothing. Black plays king e7. He's actually doing fantastic. Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. This is good for black. So what you do, you play bishop f4, black castle short, and now you pursue the queen. You pursue the queen again, and you take with the queen. So this position instantly gives some better chances for white. Like after queen d8, I played this a couple of times in classical games. I think I played e4 and just got a better position. e4, a long castle, or maybe there was even a long castle here. Long castle, knight e8, or something like this. But to be honest, I don't remember the details. It is possible. So I think if I'm going to remember, I'm going to update the PGN. All right. Yeah, that's a good question. Right, once again, c4, c5, this is the main line. So people who know what they're doing, they're going to go here. What I did not mention, there's the move. There's, of course, the testing move, knight b5. What I did not mention is the move g3. And you're probably wondering, why not play g3 immediately? Well, it's a very heavy theory. That's why. Like, this comes from the times of Viktor Korchnoi. I think Korchnoi came up with the system 60s or 70s, I already don't remember. And you might have seen this quite recently, a couple of cycles ago in the candidates tournament. Anish Giri against Jan Nepomniachtchi, round 1, they were testing this line. This is old. This is really old. It's fascinating, crazy stuff. right? So you can analyze this. There's queen c6, etc. But the bottom line is black is fine. And also Nepomniachtchi managed to solve all the problems in the opening, and there's just nothing here. And at a good level, everybody knows this already, kind of. I remember I was analyzing this 10 years ago with my student at the time, Nikita Meshkov. We're having some training sessions, we're analyzing this line, and we try to make it work. Now, I'm not ignoring your questions, let me explain. I just said I would like to keep most questions to the questions and answers, all right? Most questions go to the questions and answers, and I answer very simple questions during the bootcamp so that the natural flow doesn't stop. So, yeah, G3, again, it's not included. I think that A3 is a bit simpler. And again, this is probably the main line. Pretty easy, but I think also black is doing pretty fine. Like black is doing pretty fine, but still, those of you who are going to study this symmetrical English, you're going to figure out it's pretty easy to play for white. Let's move on. Next part. Next part is going to overlap with something I talked about in my Catalan bootcamp. Because your opponent can play e6. How comes I'm not in Weissenhaus? Because I'm in Riga. That's why. I'm a big fan of the traditional chess. So, we start with this position. So c4, e6. This is something I talked about in the, maybe it was not the Catalan bootcamp, maybe it was the Reti bootcamp. I don't remember because again, it's quite transpositional. So what you want to understand, if you are going with knight f3 and g3, I think actually maybe I was the one who came up with the title of Neo-Catalan. Like, I thought it's a very logical name and everybody's using it ever since, but maybe it was not me. Maybe somebody already came up with the idea before, doesn't really matter. So the point is, we are avoiding d4 for the moment. But the trick here is you have committed to knight f3. And this is something I talked about in the Catalan bootcamp. So you give a check, you play queen c4, black plays a6, b5, bishop b7, and he solves the problem of the Lasco bishop, of the bad Catalan bishop. So if your opponent plays e6, again, you can switch to d4. But probably we're going to still stick to the spirit, to the English opening as much as we can. And since I'm a big fan of the Catalan opening, we're going to play g3. So where's the difference? The difference is, if black plays d5, you play bishop g2 and not knight f3. If black decides to take on c4, you're winning back the pawn. But he cannot solve the problems of the Lasco bishop. So again, if you're inaccurate, you play knight f3. He's going to play b5 and bishop b7. Problem solved. Like, by the way, queen c6 changes nothing. It just changes nothing. Rook b8. And there's no follow-up. Bishop b7 is incoming. You cannot do that. So the point is, if he plays a6, you have to retreat with the queen. Either queen c2 or queen b3. You choose. I'm a big fan of queen c2. I like it. So I'm going to stick to it. So the point is, we're retreating with the queen so that black cannot solve the problems of the Catalan bad bishop. And the line continues, knight f6. Now you play knight f3. So he cannot play b5. There's going to be knight e4. And knight c6. That's a very annoying knight. So he cannot do that. He plays c5 to stop knight e4. Now the next important move. You go here. Why? If you castle short, he plays b5. If you go here or here, he plays knight d5. Knight c6 is nothing, there's queen b6. That's a big difference. So that's why here, for you to stop this, you have to play knight c3. And again, he cannot solve the problems of the Catalan bishop. If he plays b5, there's knight e5, and the d5 square is challenged twice by your knight and the bishop. So the move order here is really important. So that's why black probably wants to solve the problem of the Catalan bishop, like queen c7, short castle, and he has to do something like b6. Be very accurate. And white always keeps a slightly better position. So even though black has solved the problem of the last bishop, there's not much you can really do about it, because this feels like a nice Catalan position. White still has some edge. And there's a game, by the way. I played this line a couple of times. And guess what? Who was my opponent? My opponent was Grzegorz Gajewski. He was the coach of the Mirajo Gukesh, the current world champion. I played against Gukesh's coach in Bundesliga, year 2022. This was the position. And here Gajewski, I don't think he was very accurate. He played b5. And there's this very nice idea. a4, you challenge the pawn on b5, you ask a lot of questions for black. And now this knight gets rerouted to c4. And also notice this maneuver, d3. You don't always have to play d4. You can play d3, put the knight on c4, and play e4 at some point to completely squeeze your opponent and take away many critical squares. This is how the game proceeded. I got a pretty significant advantage after the opening. But to be honest, I just did not know what to do next. Like, I definitely knew I have an advantage. The position felt like a great king's Indian attack position at a king side, but I just didn't really know how to proceed. And the game finished in a draw. So this is what I played myself. By the way, everything I'm recommending, I'm playing myself. So now you know why it's important to start with g3 and bishop g2. Of course, your game might never go in this direction, but you are simply removing your black the easy opportunity to solve the problem of the bad light square bishop on c8. So you play bishop g2. If he plays knight f6, now you play knight f3. And again, the point is d takes on c4 is basically the same. Queen a4, knight e7, queen c4, a6, and queen c2. Again, remember, b5 is knight e4, c5 is knight c3. We transpose. So you don't allow your opponent easily get the light square bishop in the game. And even if you forget all of this, you just should remember one thing. You don't want black to allow the light square bishop to be landing on b7. As long as you do that, you're going to figure it out. By the way, this line, after queen a4, there's also the very tricky system with bishop d7. I think that at the professional level, this line has been worked out to a draw. At least I think so. The point is, after queen x on c4, black plays c5. He wants to play bishop c6 and again solve the problem of the Catalan bishop. So you have to play knight e5 to stop this. Black goes here, and no matter how you look at this position, white will get the bishop pair. So basically, I can just stop the variation right here. You can do whatever you want. You can play short castle, you can play c3, you can play b3. Your opponent is going to play knight c6, and you just trade on d7 and try to open up the position and increase the power of your light square bishop on g2. That's it. There are some games that I played in this line myself, and the story is that I picked up the small queen d3, which was, I believe, for the first time played by Alexander Grishuk. And the year was, I don't remember, maybe 2015, 16, something. And at the time, this was a very rare move. And years later, now this is the main move in the position. So the point is, you want to take on d7, and if black is not very cautious and he trades with the queens, as this happened in my game against Yuri Krikon in 2017. By the way, Yuri, right now, he is acclaimed chessable author, and he definitely has already learned from the mistake, but back then he was just a kid, and he didn't know that you cannot trade the queens. And the point is, I get a very nice position, kept the king in the center, and just launched a very powerful pawn march at the king side, and black has major problems to organize his plan. You can check out the full game in the PGN if you're interested, but that's why here the theory suggests that black should avoid a queen trade. And not everybody understands it. So knight e7, and you just play a quiet positional game, but like I already said, the modern stance, understanding of this position is black is rock solid, but it's very difficult for him to do anything. Same applies for white. You have two bishops. Black essentially sits and does nothing. He plays rook c8, b6, bishop f6, brick wall. So it's not so easy for you to crash through, as long as, I mean, you don't want to trade your bishop pair, especially the dark split bishop. So this is a very interesting line. But if we go back to the position after knight f3, black can use the fact that you have not closed the doors with not including d4, and he can play d4 himself. You know, I have mixed feelings about this move. Like, one part of me is saying that with this move, black is being very ambitious. But the other part also says, because of this move, white suddenly has chances to create a disbalance for the game. By the way, that being said, if I would have to go back to this position, this move d4, for example, after knight f3, d5 and c4, I believe is absolutely the best move, because black has not committed to e6, like we just saw in the position, and he can build up pretty much the perfect setup and try to claim the space advantage. Now, what we saw in the game, here you see black has already committed to e6, and d4 is possible, but this no longer is the ideal setup for black. Still, I believe it's a very challenging way to play. Now, there's a couple of tricks I would like to show you in this line. So we are going to play should castle. And if black plays c5, and I do believe most people play like this, I suggest to start with d3. And if your opponent is not careful, you want to switch to the king's Indian attack. Like he plays, let's say he plays bishop e7, you play e4. So where's the big deal? Like, okay, I suppose you don't want to take on e3, bishop e3, d4, Catalan bishop. Again, black has some problems because of the light square bishop. Your bishop on g2 is going to make his life really difficult. So I suppose black cannot do that. But now the point is, after knight c6, you play e5. And those of you who have seen my King's Indian Attack, French King's Indian Attack bootcamp, and those of you who have purchased my Chessable King's Indian Attack course, you're looking at this and you're thinking, this is the dream setup for white in the King's Indian Attack. Why is this? Because in the King's Indian Attack, you are attacking the king side, and your opponent is supposed to organize a counterplay at the queen side, and we have already locked it away. So any a6, b5 idea, you just play b3 and b takes on c4. That's it. You keep things closed, and you just go for a typical king side attack. So those of you who are slightly forgetting it, rook e1, knight e2, knight f1, knight h2, knight g4, h5, bishop f4, h6, etc. Everything is really standard. That's why the king's in attack is such a popular weapon. And who could have thought you can get it even from this position? So that's why the move order really for black is important. He has to play knight c6. And now e4 is not very good because black gets to play e5. Now you know. So if black plays knight c6 immediately, you play e3, and you're playing a very good version of the modern Benoni. So if you happen to learn some things about the modern Benoni, and you're thinking about playing the English opening against this Neo-Catalan setup, you can definitely consider this. So let's say bishop e7, typical idea is knight a3, knight c2, rook e1, b3, a3, rook b1, b4, organize a queenside pawn majority play. Same applies if black plays bishop d6. You take it, you play knight a3, bishop a3, by the way, is not dangerous. Black needs the dogs with bishop. Knight c2, e5, b4, again, with a very rich game. So black probably cannot really take it, because after knight e5, this bishop is very strong, this bishop is pretty bad, and white always keeps the better position after rook b1. So, d4, like I already said, I have mixed feelings. It's a nice, ambitious move, but black will need to back up with some serious play. And again, by the way, I am not covering everything here. This is not the purpose. Like the point after short castle, somebody is watching this and wondering, yeah, but what about knight c6? What about bishop c5? What about d3? Of course, there's many moves. Like here, black could play knight c6, of course. You can play d3, e5, e3, let's say bishop e7, takes, rook e1. I think the position just basically plays itself. You're playing it like a modern Benoni, where black has advanced with a pawn on d4, but it's not really clear what black achieves with this. Yeah, you want to play bishop f4, knight e5, open up the bishop on g2, and try to exploit the long diagonal. And finally, in this position, what else black can do? Black can just ignore all of this. Play bishop e7. You play castles, and we're back. Do you want to play the classical Catalan with d4 or you do not? You need to figure this out. Now, there is a big difference. You're probably wondering, we still go to the same position of the Catalan. What does it matter? It does matter. Let me show you why it matters. If you're playing the position as a normal Catalan, you're playing d4, knight f6, c4, or even let's say with d5, doesn't really matter. Let's say d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3. There's many setups. Black can play d takes on c4, try to hold on to the pawn. Black can give you a check, bishop b4 check, which is a very, very typical intermezzo move to play either bishop d6 or bishop e7. The bishop on d2 sometimes is misplaced. Black can even play a5, a very popular setup with the idea to capture the pawn on c4 again. And now, if you play with this move order, and you, of course, close some doors and open new doors, etc., and your opponent plays like, okay, I gotta give it the bishop b4 check, I have to go here. If you play d4, you have essentially tricked your opponent. There's no bishop b4 check. There's no early d takes on c4. I mean, that being said, he can of course still play it. This is a super popular system, but you have avoided some early ideas. But again, I'm gonna still try to stick to the English opening as much as I can, even though I believe right now we are in the realm of the, whatever is this? Is this even Reti opening, Neo-Catalan, or English opening? It doesn't really matter. You play b3. Very nice idea. And I have to confess to you, I'm slightly regretting this is that I haven't used this continuation more. I should have used it more. And again, black has a number of choices here. He can play either c5, he can play b6, there's some other continuations as well. But let's say he plays c5. You take on d5 immediately. If you play bishop b2, you're locking your bishop, and even though you are transposing to the modern Benoni, the bishop on b2 is misplaced. This is not where it's supposed to be, because it's staring at the pawn on d4. So that's why you include c takes on d5. If black plays e takes on d5, you play d4. IQP again. Take on c5, bishop b2, knight c3, e3, queen e2, rook d1, rook c1, etc. Black has an isolated pawn on d5, which means a long-term pressure. Black could, of course, also take on d5 with a knight. Some people are afraid of the IQPs. You can take with a knight. You play bishop e2, knight c6, and guess what? You transposed some sort of a Catalan again. So black has this problem with the bishop on c8, and that's why if you want to like broaden your understanding, I would advise you to go back after this bootcamp and check my Catalan bootcamp, because I was mainly explaining the ideas, the concepts that you should know. That's why the Catalan is so popular, because you maybe don't really need so much theory. As long as you know the big fight is against the bad bishop on c8, you know a couple of typical ideas, you're set. You don't need a lot. So this is what happens if black plays c5. But if black plays b6, this is the moment again when you take on d5. By the way, and you might be wondering, but why am I not immediately taking on d5 right now? If c takes on d5 is such a big deal, why you're not taking on d5 right away? The point is, black is going to play c6, not c5. And he has the perfect clasped structure. The bishop is going to go out somewhere here, the knight is going to go to d7, and your bishop on g2 for the clasped is misplaced. I mean, you can do it, of course, like d3, knight c3, e4, etc., but be warned, you have nothing here. So the point is, you want to take on d5, but at the right moment. Like you want to play b3, and if he plays b6, now it's the perfect moment to take it. Because if he takes with a pawn, you play bishop e2, and now he can no longer set up the perfect clasped setup, because the pawn on c6 will be always weak. Final nuance. Do not push d4 before black has committed to c5. That's all you need to remember. You play e3, otherwise knight c3 will be met with d4. You play e3, you play knight c3. So you have a lot of easy moves. You want to play like rook c1, maybe queen c2, knight e2, knight e4, knight f5, maybe knight f4. There's a lot of easy moves, like maybe even knight e4, knight f5, try to up the bishop on g2. Your opponent is going to play c5, I guarantee. As soon as he does this, boom, d4. So the idea is that eventually you want to take on c5, you want to put the rooks at the c file and d file and hammer these pawns. And this, dear viewers, is going to lead us to one of the topics I'm going to talk about in one of the upcoming bootcamps. I still have not made a bootcamp about it, and I'm going to call it the hanging pawns. How to play against the hanging pawns. So ultimately, I think you'll be set. You'll have studied the Reti bootcamp, you'll have studied the Catalan bootcamp, maybe some Kingston attack bootcamp. Now arm it with the English bootcamp so that you can freely improvise and then add hanging pawns, add IQP pawns. You're going to be masters of the game. So let's go back. Yeah, basically that's about the Neo-Catalan. I mean, There are some other lines, like, I did not really mention all the tricks, like black could just be stubborn and play like knight e7, bishop b2, and c6. I think it makes sense for you to play d4. This is not included in the PGN, but you can even improvise here, like, why not play something like d3, play like English opening. Let's say he plays b6 and you put the knight on c3, think about the e4 ideas, or maybe e3, queen e2, rook d1, rook c1, etc. And if he plays c5, you take it, you play d4. I cannot cover everything, right? But I think at least I will give you a pretty good start, so you know what is good, what is not good, and on what should you pay attention. How does the Neo-Catalan and Catalan differ? That's of course a very good question. Neo-Catalan, it means the white pawn stays on d2. So it not always is going to go to d4, but you can. You can. That's the beauty of it. You play the English opening, you can transpose. All right, and we have one more theoretical part. The English Slav. This is going to be the fifth and final part of the theoretical discussion we're having here. I hope it has been more or less productive so far. Now, what to do against this? By the way, as I already said, most players you're going to play, they don't have a single repertoire against c4. So they know what to do against d4. They know what to do against e4. But they might not have anything concrete against knight f3 or c4. And that's why very often I'm scoring a lot of points against lower-rated opponents, even the pretty good players. I just make this carousel with the move order, and they're confused because their typical knowledge no longer works. So I make this carousel, I trick them with the move order, and I very often land them in positions they don't really know. So the point is, after c4, these are the players who play the Slav. Like I'm talking about d4, d5, c4, c6. Super popular opening. Great opening, by the way. I think it makes sense for me at some point to make a bootcamp about it. I don't play this, but since I'm a coach, I'm supposed to know. And after c4, black can insist on the Slav. Like black wants to play d5 next move. So what does it matter? And again, if you're a fan of the Slav setups, you don't mind it, you can play d4, no problem. There are some players who really prefer the pawn-off position, e4. Now the point is, after d5 takes, you get to play d4. This is also covered in some Caracan courses, I believe. You can start with the move e4, e4, c6, and should it be c4, the next move, or d4, d5, takes, c4, the pawn-off system. It has some attacking properties, but to be honest, I think the modern evaluation of this line is that black is fine, which I suppose can be said about every single operation. But anyway, we are going to try to stick to the English as much as we can. So knight f3, d5, and here again you have a choice between the more complex continuation and simpler continuation. And mostly in this bootcamp, I try to keep things simple. So the challenging continuation is g3. So if you're really serious about very serious advancement, etc., you should play g3 probably. g3, black accepts the pawn, you play bishop g2, you sacrifice the pawn, knight a3, queen c2, there's a very, very big struggle, but the point is that sometimes you're even happy to sacrifice the pawn. Like you play b3, c takes, a takes, you grab the center, d4, e4, part of my silly arrows, you're happy. Like it's a pretty common idea. But if you don't feel like it, you just play e3. e3 knight f6 and knight c3. And now the best part. Black cannot easily get to the Slav positions with this move order. Look at this. So if he plays bishop g4, because this is one of the big ideas of the Slav, you haven't yet played d4. You play c6 on d5. If he takes it, just a second. Yeah, if he takes it, you play queen b3. Why is it not working anymore? Yeah, queen b3. This pawn is suddenly under attack. And if black plays queen b6, there's knight e5. If black plays queen b3, this is an intermezzo check. Very, very important idea. Why d2 gives you a critical tempi. What is not answering? Now, this is not only for YouTube, this is also for Twitch. But listen, everybody who is watching, I would like to remind you there will be a questions and answers after the theoretical part. I have said this already a couple of times. So this bishop g4 is not really accurate because queen b3 create problems, but you have to start with this move. Because if you start with queen b3, queen b6, you start with c6 with d5, the queen move, queen b3 makes the difference. And black is okay. Black is very much okay in this position. So after c6 and d5, he has to take on f3, and you just get two bishops. Like bishop b5, and I mean, I looked at some lines here. You give up the bishop, but you get a very easy game. Like this. The weakness on c6 is there to stay, easy target, you have well-developed pieces. Maybe this pawn can be played like d3, e4. There's no need for you to play d4 automatically to close your bishop on b2. So you're just doing fantastic. The same applies also for bishop f5, which is not a very good move. Because again, you play c6, c6 on queen b3. And the same idea, queen b6 is knight e5. Pretty easy to remember. So black has to play the only move, bishop c8, to keep the position together. So you play bishop b5 check, you play d3, e4, same idea again. d3, e4, bring out the Daxo bishop, and you just basically secure a pretty solid advantage in all the lines. So black cannot really do all of those things. But what can he do? The main move is e6. But this means that your opponent has to switch from the Slav, which is the bishop f5 line, to the semi-Slav. The bishop on c8 is blocked. And not everybody likes to play these positions because now the bishop on c8 might be feeling not great. So again, at every given moment, you can play d4, switch to the main lines, which is going to lead to some very, very big theory, the Moran, etc. Again, we are not going to do that. So you can play b3. Now there's a nuance. Knight e7 is apparently more accurate than bishop d6, so many people don't even pay attention to this move. What's the difference between knight e7 and bishop d6? But the point is, after bishop d6, white can avoid playing bishop b2. For example, d4, knight e7, bishop d3, and there's some fascinating lines. So black eventually is pushing e5. You take it once, you play knight b5, and now you see, this is why playing bishop b2 early would have been a waste of time. Bishop b4 check, now it's going to be simply bishop d2, and there's a check on d6 threatening. So bishop b8, and again, IQP. There's even some fascinating lines like g takes on f3, open up the g file, like rook g1, queen d2, long castle, expose the long diagonal for your Daxo bishop, which gives you very, very nice attacking ideas. I mean, of course, black doesn't really have to do all of this. Like playing e5 immediately, he can castle short. You castle short. And if he plays e5 now, again, c takes, again, knight b5, again, you take on e5, and you put the knight on d4. Again, IQP. The only difference here is you have committed to this short castle. And you just slowly rearrange your pieces. a4, bishop a3, you stop this battery of the queen and the bishop. And again, black has a long-term weakness of the weakness on d5. Yes, this will be available on YouTube as well a week later. So repeating, I know some people joined a bit later, this is completely fine. So there's no harm in asking. Thank you for doing this. The video with the PGN, the source file, will be available later today already on my YouTube channel. Sorry, what I'm saying, not YouTube channel, my Patreon page. So you can find the link in the chat command. But it will be only available for the starting supporter level. Starting with the supporter level, this will be available immediately with the PGN. Everybody else will get the video on YouTube a week later. That's why I would like to make it for my patrons this a bit more special. But of course, everybody can watch it live, completely free. Let's go back a bit. Yeah, that's why I said that here this bishop d6 is not entirely accurate. Knight e7 is a bit more precise, since black wants to play e5, bishop b2, bishop d6. And here the trick is, you can be, again, playing this position as some sort of Sicilian Tamanov. So the queen is on c2, pawn is on c4, two knights are out, and there's a lot of tricks. But again, the point is, you don't really have to play d4 if you don't want to. For example, here, bishop e2, and let's say black goes e5, you could probably take it. I didn't check this line, by the way. Knight e5, and here, and bishop a3, and here, and knight e6, so you get the dox with bishop for some very exciting lines. But I just wanted to show you this one more final trick. After b6, Engine here gives some fascinating ideas. Like you can play rook g1 with the idea to play g4, g5, g4, g5, h4, and at the right moment castle alongside. So this feels like some sort of a version of the Shirov-Shabalov attack. Like e5, g4, the pawn on d5 is now vulnerable. Let's say e4, knight e4, g5, long castle, etc. It's fascinating. The reverse Sicilian has been covered already since the very beginning. I believe that's mostly it. Let me check if I missed any lines. Yeah, there's some other smaller lines, like if black plays g6, some people like it. You can now switch to d4. Again, a very easy game. And by the way, this setup for black is not really that great because white easily gets a nice and quiet game at the queen side. The bishop on g7 for black. I mean, it feels like a weird version of the symmetrical Grunfeld. Thank you, Doges, for the raid. Appreciate it. So, I believe now the theoretical part is over. So I slightly exceeded my discussion for 50 minutes. Originally, I was planning to be about 2 hours. So now, like I already said, the bootcamp is officially over. This will be available on YouTube channel, but you have the opportunity to ask any questions. If there was something you did not understand, like some lines, some setups, what's the difference, etc., we can talk about this right now.